Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for taking the time to attend this event. My name is Calvin Bahir. I'm a principal economist at GSMA Intelligence, and we're one of the co-hosts of this event, along with their fellow co-hosts, BT, T-Mobile, Orange, Telefonica, Telia Company, Vodafone, Ericsson, Huawei, and Nokia. I arrived in Barcelona a little bit earlier than probably most of you last Friday, and I can say that this is one of the events I've been most looking forward to. As with most of you, I think we're all interested in this topic in spectrum. There aren't many people, probably in certainly my family and friends, who are very interested in this topic. So it's not often that we get the chance to discuss something we're all interested in with this many people. So on my side, I've been very much looking forward to it. I guess most of you know that the background to this, the future of the 6 gigahertz band is going to be extremely important. It's going to shape the next 10, 15, 20 years of 5G and Wi-Fi across pretty much all countries. And I think all policymakers and vendors, operators, everyone involved, well, everyone in the world really, has an interest in this topic. While the interest has been quite significant, and we've seen a number of countries take different approaches to this band, one of the things, certainly within GSMA Intelligence and being an economist, we found some of the underlying analysis and evidence behind what to do with this band a little bit lacking. So we've had a number of claims, for example, around the growth of 5G and how it will need more spectrum. We've heard about the growth in Wi-Fi traffic and how that will need more spectrum, all of which are quite plausible, but very little in the way of trying to understand, right, well, how exactly do we expect these technologies to evolve, and what will the demand look like, and what actually, what is the capacity, and what potentially are the constraints. So with that in mind, that this is an area that both the GSMA and our team in GSMA Intelligence have been trying to address during the last 6 to 12 months. So the structure of this session will be that we will present a couple of those, two of those studies that we've been working on. And once that's done, we'll be, I think one of the parts I'm really looking forward to is hearing a wide range of views from regulators, policymakers, views from industry, including operators and vendors, giving their reactions to some of the evidence and analysis we'll present, and also offering their own views and expertise based on the markets they are familiar with. So I'm not going to take any more time because I think everyone wants us to get into the really interesting part of the session. So I'll be back in about 10 minutes to present one of the GSMA Intelligence studies. But first, I'm going to invite my colleague, Louise Zogby, from the GSMA Spectrum team, to present one of the studies that they've been doing recently. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Calvin. And thank you very much as well for all the other co-hosts, not just the GSMAI, for the opportunity to be here today and for the invitation for the GSMA to participate on this amazing panel today. So I think before going into the spectrum needs conversation we're going to have in those 10 minutes that I have, I'd like to remind you about the difference between the technologies before 5G and 5G. 5G is not about an evolution. It's not about another G. 5G is a revolution. 5G is actually bringing things we haven't seen before, or we have seen something limited with technologies that we saw before. So what I'd like to show here, and this is from our latest GSMA report on socioeconomic benefits, is how we see those different things apart from mobile, enhanced mobile broadband, that will be what 5G can bring to us. So we also have in mind super low latency coming from 5G, such as whenever we need to have a remote surgery. We also have massive IoT. We've seen IoT before, we know the capabilities of it, but 5G will unlock even more, especially whenever you have millions and billions of connections at the same time. And lastly, FWA, fixed wireless access, is one of the biggest things and as we say, just for mid-bands, 12% of mid-band socioeconomic benefits will come from it, is that FWA is part of what 5G can bring. Why? Because 5G can create a possibility of fiber-like speeds that were not possible before, with a reliability that was not possible before, so people can have access to quality of service everywhere, as well as with just a percentage of the cost of fiber, for example. And if we move forward into the specific bands that 5G will require throughout time, we have to look into the IMT 2020 requirements. And we worked with Colego Consulting, and Stefan is here today and will be also with you in the panel. So we worked with Colego Consulting to understand how we would know exactly the amount of spectrum needed for 5G, and in this case, on mid-bands that we're going to talk specifically about today. But we cannot forget that 5G is needed not just in mid-bands, but also in low and high bands, such as UHF, whenever it talks about coverage, and whenever we go into millimeter waves, we're talking about a super capacity, and you see the usages that we put there. But let's focus on the mid-bands today. So for us to look into the IMT 2020 requirements, our goal was to discover the amount of spectrum we need whenever it comes to the 100 megabits per second downlink and 50 megabits per second uplink, that we believe is one of the best ways of looking into how we can actually move forward in mid-bands to understand the amount of spectrum needed. And if we move into the specific work that we did, and the GSMA has also, not just with the results from Colego, we also put our visions up to 2030 based on the results, is that looking into how much spectrum is needed to provide the 100 megabits per second downlink and 50 megabits per second uplink, Colego looked at with us on 36 different cities around the world. The study was based in population density, the spectrum that would be possibly available until 2025, that's what we expect, and then we looked into the additional for 2030, but the results are total. We looked into an inter-site distance of an average of 400 meters. We looked into data from operators. We confirmed, and we know that in places such as Tokyo and in Manhattan, this is not the case. An inter-site distance is even lower. And then we also considered that 5G would be in every mid-band, so conservatively to make sure that we are putting the right amount here for you, as well as minor upgrades and use of small cells. Whenever we talk about offload, there is a consideration about offload, not just for indoor small cells and Wi-Fi, but also in high bands. So the study considers that not just mid-bands will be available, but high bands as well. So the number is also conservative considering that. And there's one of the most important ones is the cellular network activity factor. The cellular network activity factor is the percentage of users at the same time requiring those 100 megabits per second downlink or the 50 megabits per second uplink. So conservatively, we create kind of a level of percentage that grows within time up to 2030 for us to understand that need throughout time. So, and what is the vision of the GSMA from the results that were brought from this work? So the first one is that in average, 2 gigahertz of mid-band spectrum will be needed up to 2030, available and in use. And that means that if that is not available, there is a risk of 5G not being 100% unlocked in mid-bands. As well as whenever we look into the possibility, for example, in densifying those networks, we see that in most cases, or most of the cases, or in a big number of cases, that's not even possible because you cannot reduce the inter-site distance. But where you can do it, that can be up to 5 times more base stations in a specific city. And that's not good for the investment, the capabilities of the operators, but also not good for the environment as well. And if we look into the benefits of it, we're not talking about just cities that are in the high-income countries. We're talking about cities all over the world. Those 2 gigahertz are everywhere. And not just those dense cities. The benefits that those 2 gigahertz bring to FWA are immense. With comparing 1 gigahertz to 2 gigahertz on FWA, you require a lot less base stations to cover one single town or village. So that means with the right amount of spectrum, one single base station could be able to provide FWA for the entire town. So that's one of the results that are really important, because we're talking about benefits not just for some people, but for the whole society. And then the next question is, where is that spectrum coming from? If we think about 2 gigahertz and the availability of spectrum, we look into the legacy ones there in the beginning of the graph that you're seeing. And then you look into the ones that are being made not just available, but under debate. So if we talk about 3.5 gigahertz, if we talk about this in different countries, there are different positions around the world. So that means 3.5 gigahertz should be put forward immediately, and based on the availability in countries, and looking into making sure that it's clean and available to operators. But another band that is going to be explored specifically today is 6 gigahertz. So looking into the details specifically in lots of countries you see around the world, there's no other way to get to those 2 gigahertz, and I haven't seen a place where the availability of 3.5 plus the rest would not require at least part of those 6 gigahertz, so we can get to those 2 gigahertz we need. So the conversation about 6 gigahertz is important, not just because 6 gigahertz is an incredible band, a mid band in between coverage and capacity, but also because there's no way to get those 2 gigahertz without considering all those bands that you see here. And my last slide is just to say that GSMA has just released one report, and then you may have seen during the presentation from our head of spectrum, that talks about the socioeconomic benefits of mid-bands. The results are incredible, showing that $610 billion in 2030, we're not talking about summing those numbers, in 2030 will come socioeconomic benefits from mid-bands. That represents a high amount in GDP, and that's and then you can also see other bands there, but you can see how big the importance of mid-band is to the GDP that is brought if the right amount of spectrum with the right prices and the right licensing framework is made available to operators. Thank you very much. I'll hand over to Calvin again, and have a great session.
Thank you very much, Luis. Right, so I'm going to present a study that we actually just published at the end of January, so this is still very much hot off the press, looking at the socio-economic benefits of the 6 gigahertz band and considering different policy options. So just to provide the context, so we've already seen countries take some divergent approaches to the 6 gigahertz band. Some, for example, the US and Canada have already licensed the full band for unlicensed use. Some are considering using the entire band for licensed use, initially 5G and IMT, and some have currently or are considering doing the lower part or the lower 500 megahertz for unlicensed, and then the upper part maybe for licensed. So as so many countries are considering this, what we did in this study was to try and assist policymakers to undertake a cost-benefit analysis or socio-economic benefit analysis to understand which of these approaches could generate the greatest value for a country's wider economy and society, which is ultimately what the assignment of spectrum should be about, and it's what's recommended by most international best practice. So just one thing to flag, I'll be talking about different scenarios. The ones to remember are the 3 scenarios we consider are those that are ones that are mostly being contemplated. So scenario 1 is assigning the full band for licensed use. Scenario 2 is everything for unlicensed. And scenario 3 is splitting the band, lower part for unlicensed, upper part for licensed. And the full details of the report methodology can be found in the study. I won't go through it here because sadly I don't have enough time. But in short, what we do is for each of the 12 study countries, we look at the expected supply or capacity of both 5G and Wi-Fi going forward based on existing and hypothetical amounts of spectrum. And then we also look at how demand will evolve in those markets. And we look at if there's a capacity constraint for either of those services, then we try and understand the extent to which 6 gigahertz will alleviate that, and therefore where it will drive the greatest benefit. And the analysis is over a 15-year time period. Obviously, when you're doing an analysis like this, especially one that's forecasting 15 years, there's a lot of inputs and assumptions. I won't go through all of those, but there are a few that we found were quite key to our results, and I'll be presenting some of the result sensitivities. But the ones I wanted to highlight were threefold. One is that the amount of capacity depends on the existing spectrum available for 5G, both in particularly in mid bands, but also high millimeter wave bands. The same applies to Wi-Fi as well. Related to that, on the second point, I did want to highlight the utilization of high band spectrum. So we all know the use cases and the fact that 5G is going to leverage a millimeter wave to address very high for use cases that require very fast speeds and very intense amounts of traffic. High band spectrum in the 60 gigahertz band is also currently available or is expected to be available for unlicensed Wi-Fi and can potentially support WiGig services that require high bandwidths. This is something that's perhaps less talked or known about, but it's quite key when thinking about the capacity of Wi-Fi. And lastly, a key assumption on the Wi-Fi side is the speeds that are supported by the underlying infrastructure. So Wi-Fi typically connects the final point to the end user based on an underlying copper, fiber, or fixed wireless access connection. I live just south of London and actually recently switched my service to a fixed fiber to the home. When I was looking at my options out of all of the providers, the maximum speed that was available was just less than 400 megabits per second. So that's important because ultimately that's one of the constraints on Wi-Fi. If the maximum speed is 400, then you're not going to get anything faster no matter how much Wi-Fi capacity you've got. So I'm going to jump straight into the results. So thinking about what I mentioned in terms of capacity. So we found that if less spectrum is assigned to 5G in the 6 gigahertz band, then it's likely to either lead to higher costs or lower speeds. So on the left there, what we show in red, for example, we look at a scenario to say, on average in our countries, let's look at the typical cost of deploying 5G based on expected demand with the full band, and let's compare that to if operators didn't have the 6 gigahertz spectrum. And we found that over the period, then the annual CapEx and OpEx costs will probably increase by around 70%. If they have just the upper part of the band, then costs would increase by around 20%. Alternatively, as Luis said, we know that without enough mid-band spectrum, it could be that network densification and deploying more sites might not be technically feasible. So in that case, consumers could potentially experience a quality of service degradation, i.e. they may not get the promised 100 megabits per second. If we assume that there's no any network densification carried out, then we found that with no further spectrum in the 6 gigahertz band, speeds would be just over 40 megabits per second, and with the upper part, it would be around 80. In practice, we'd probably likely be between those two scenarios, but I think they illustrate the potential impact of not having enough spectrum for 5G. On the Wi-Fi side, we looked at a typical household demand for fixed broadband and therefore its impact on Wi-Fi. The three lines you can see there are, the bottom line is on average in our countries of studies, what's the capacity based on the existing amount of 2.4 and 5 gigahertz spectrum. So it's just less than 5 gigabits per second. If you have the lower part of the band, then you have the middle line, just over 10 gigabits. And if you have the full band, then it's the top line, which is around 20 gigabits per second. And then we studied 12 countries, and they vary quite significantly to countries with very high fixed broadband penetration rates and very high consumer demand and device demand, for example, in UAE, France, and Qatar, to countries where the demand for fixed broadband infrastructure is more limited, Kenya and Ghana being two examples. So what we've got with those three lines is a household 1, 2, and 3. So the top household 1 is what we expect demand would be based on 11 connected devices being concurrently used. So that was the most we saw in our study. And in that case, you can see that crosses the baseline capacity around 2029. So in that country, there would be some capacity constraint. But if we look at the household 3, where there's less devices used in a typical household, in that case, it's not clear that the level of demand, even over a 15-year period, would reach a point where there's a capacity crunch on existing Wi-Fi spectrum. So it does highlight that although a lot of these themes are common, this sort of analysis and the expected market developments, they really do vary by country, which is why we're very much in favor of countries applying some of this analysis and building on it in their particular markets. So I'm just going to go through some of the key results. So what we've got here is the economic impacts expressed as a proportion of GDP in 2035. The green dots are scenario 1, so that's the impact if you assign the full band for licensed 5G. The red ones are unlicensed, and the purple ones are the split band approach. So this first slide here, this assumes that the maximum fiber to the home or cable speeds will reach 5 gigabits. I know I mentioned at the moment, a lot of people probably can't access more than 400 or 500, but over a 15-year time frame, we would obviously expect that to increase. But this assumes that there's the maximum speeds of 5 gigabits, and we also assume that there will be some utilization of high band spectrum for Wi-Fi over this period, especially over 15 years. And we find that in this scenario, across pretty much all of our countries of study, the policy that has the greatest benefit is assigning the full band to licensed. For the main reason being that if the maximum speed is 5 gigabits on fixed broadband, and if they have access and can utilize high band spectrum, then actually there shouldn't be a significant capacity constraint, even in high bandwidth markets. So in that case, we find that scenario 1 drives the largest benefits. If we assume that, going forward, we know the countries are prioritizing the improvement of their digital infrastructure. If we change our assumption to say actually speeds potentially could reach even more than 5 gigabits, if we assume it gets close to 10 gigabits per second, which could be achieved, then even in that case, scenario 1 still generally generates the greatest benefits if you assume that the high band spectrum for Wi-Fi is utilized, because again, that if up to 30% of the traffic is utilized, then there should be enough capacity. There are some countries there, I think you can see France and Mexico, for example, where even with the high band, there would still be some capacity constraint on Wi-Fi. And in that case, we find that scenario 3, the split band approach, would drive the largest benefit. And then the other scenario I wanted to show was, let's assume that the speeds are 10 gigabits per second on fixed broadband, but let's assume that the high band is either not utilized or utilized to a very limited extent, which may not be the most efficient use of spectrum, but let's assume that happens. In that case, then there would, across most markets, there would be a capacity constraint on Wi-Fi given at those level of speeds and data consumption. So in this scenario, in most of our markets, we find that scenario 3 would generate the largest benefit. So that's assigning the lower part for unlicensed and the upper part for licensed use. There are some countries where scenario 1 is still generates the largest benefit. I think you can see Ghana there as one example. And the main reason for that is because in those countries, the fixed broadband infrastructure, especially fiber and cable, is still quite limited. And it's not expected to expand significantly enough to the point where it would generate a greater use and benefit than mobile networks and 5G. So to conclude, if you were going to take away, I guess, sort of 4 or 5 key findings, they're listed there. So overall, we find that the optimal assignment policy for 6 gigahertz really depends on country and market-specific circumstances. It depends on the expected adoption of 5G, how fixed fiber and cable broadband currently are, the state of infrastructure and how they will evolve, the speeds they can enable, and how much spectrum is expected to be available too. In the markets we've looked at, we found that if the maximum speeds are around 5 gigabits per second, and if countries can utilize high band spectrum, then scenario 1 would still drive the greatest benefit. If speeds can increase even higher to 10 gigabits per second, and if high band is not utilized, then in that scenario, the split band approach of lower part for unlicensed and upper part for licensed generates the greatest benefit. What was notable in our study is that across all of our countries, and across all of our sort of sensitivities, we didn't find an analysis where scenario 2, assigning the full band to unlicensed use, was found to be the most beneficial. And the reason being that even in those countries with very significant Wi-Fi demand going forward, assigning the lower band should address any capacity constraint that exists. So the study's just been published. We will be publishing a follow-up study with another 12 countries in March. So if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to get in touch, and we'll be doing, please do look out for the next report. And on that side, I think we're now ready to move on to the views from industry and policymakers. So I'm going to hand over to Stefan Zale, CEO from Colliago Consulting, to moderate the next part of the session. Thank you.
Thanks for that. So, after hearing the results of the studies and the report, we're now going to explore this in a little bit more detail. First, we'll have a session where we try to understand how industry as well as policymakers look at this. We have three regulators or policymakers responses to this, and then industry, both from operators and vendors. Then we have a panel. And after this panel, if you want to stay on, we'll also have an event, a Q&A event, also for the media. So if you want to stay on after 6 p.m., you're most welcome to do that. But so we have a mixture of people, some joining us online, and some are here in person. So we'll start actually with the views from policymakers with Eric Fournier from the Agence Nationale des Fréquences, which is a frequency regulator for France. Eric, over to you.
Thank you. Good afternoon to everyone, and sorry for participating remotely to this event, and thanks also for this possibility to speak about probably what will be the hottest topic for Spectrum Manager in the next few years. Next slide, please. Thank you. So, first speaking about the Radio LAN Wi-Fi situation in Europe, we have already the harmonization of the lower 6 GHz for Radio LAN in an EU decision, and there's also in parallel a CPT decision for an harmonization, which is for the 48 countries of CPT. We have launched within CPT some studies for the upper 6 GHz for Radio LAN on possible technical conditions under which Radio LAN could operate in this upper 6 GHz. But if you look at this work item in CPT, it's a target date which is for May 2024, which means after WRC 23, and without any harmonization measures planned at this stage, which means that we have a kind of rendezvous in 2024, depending on what will happen at WRC 23, to take a decision on the future use of this frequency band in Europe in terms of harmonization. I wanted to mention also, but that's for the lower 6 GHz, an initiative from French side, from our side, to widen technical conditions for the lower 6 GHz. As you know, the harmonization now is limited to low power indoor and to very low power radio LAN device, and we would like to enable the possibility of outdoor higher power, so just 1 watt, 4 watt radio LAN under automatic frequency coordination system, so in shared situation with fixed link. The work item has just been presented. It's expected to be adopted in May 2022, and that's a future opportunity also for radio LAN in this frequency band, including, by the way, for new radio and license usage. We had expression of interest for that in France. Next slide, please. Now, back to IMT. As you know, there's a WRC 23 agenda item on this frequency band. It's limited to region 1 only. The main issue for all these studies in preparations for WRC 23 is really the satellite, the fixed satellite service uplink protection. Where the satellite can see thousands of base stations, the satellite beam is something like continental or global beam, so it can see many base stations, and that's an international obligation through the radio regulations to protect this satellite. It's a kind of caveat. We also know that this frequency band, this uplink frequency band, will not be so much used in the future for satellite, for the simple reason that the paired downlink band is already not available or not anymore available for satellite downlink. First one, 3437, because it's now 5G IMT, so not anymore available for satellite downlink in many countries, in particular in Europe. and for the 4.5, 4.8 gigahertz, because it's a NATO band, it's used for military usage, and it's not available neither in Europe. I will come back to this FSS uplink predictions, but just one comment on Earth expression. This frequency band is also used for sea ocean surface temperature. That's something which is important, this kind of measurements for the climate change study. It does not need protection because there's no allocation status in the radio regulation for that. It's just a kind of a footnote mentioning this possibility, but we will certainly try to find a solution for that, maybe in terms of alternative band allocation, but just to mention that it's something which is also part of the landscape. And for other services, some of them are very important, fixed service, because that's intensively used in a lot of European countries. The FSS downlink, Galileo, Globalstar, for example, is using this frequency band. It's important, but it's more national issue. It's a question of coordination with base station deployment. Next slide, please. Thank you. In terms of studies of these satellite predictions, we made some what I call neutral study in this frequency band, because FSS is important for us, and IMT, of course, so we are, I think, quite neutral. We made some independent simulations which were validated with other simulations, Huawei in particular. And our result is probably in the middle of other simulations, which are sometimes showing high margin of protection and sometimes showing that the interference will be important to satellite. And what we are showing is that in general, the protection margin, so the protection of satellite, can be ensured even with a planned 5G IMT deployment in this frequency band. Next slide, please. So the main questions for until 2024 is whether there will be confirmation of the possibility of IMT in the upper 6 gigahertz. If we have that, there's something which is interesting for us. It's as a possibility of refarming fixed service, probably in this frequency band at the horizon of 2030. It will take some years, but that's a possibility. Certainly, it would provide good solutions for large spectrum blocks and good propagation that has been mentioned in the previous presentations. And we know that it's a kind of ultimate band that could be used for IMT. The frequency band in the 7 gigahertz and 8 gigahertz would be very difficult for usage for IMT. So it's a kind of last possibility for, say, easy usage for IMT. And that's why we have a lot of interest in this frequency band for IMT, recognizing the other arguments from radio land sides, interest in particular of having 320 megahertz channel, this frequency range, which would be possible with the 1 gigahertz of spectrum, which would be allowed if you combine lower and upper 6 gigahertz. The WRC 22 decision is yet really unknown. Africa and Middle East is quite split, even if some other regions like RCC strongly support IMT. From CPD side, Europe is something which is really also split views probably between different countries. But anyway, it's clear that IMT identifications would provide a very good opportunity for Europe. And the final choice will be then in 2024 between Radio LAN and IMT. It will not be decided before. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric, for that very detailed look at the 6 gigahertz in France, and by implication, I suppose, CEPT region, CPT region. Just to clarification, the event at the end is the Q&A are for the media, so not the general audience. But next up, I'm very pleased that we have Tarek El-Awadi, Executive Director of Spectrum Affairs from the TRA, the regulator, and the United Arab Emirates. Please welcome Tarek on stage.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you are doing well. It's good to see you here physically after 2 years, starting from the pandemic, and looking forward that continue like that. My name is Tariq Al-Awadi. I'm Executive Director of Spectrum Affairs TDRA at UAE and Chairman of Arab Spectrum Management Group. It's good to see here and talking about the 6 gigahertz for IMT and others. And we have seen here a lot of discussion going on and some issues. And I would like to share with you also in Arab group, in particular, what we are also decided about or what we are doing now with the 6 gigahertz. I'm not having a presentation, just a keynote speech, very quick. We are living in a digital age where a technology is at the service of humanity and its aspiration for a decent life, sustainable development and happiness. As per GSMA, this is what we got it from the report of 2021, there are more than 5.3 billion people subscribed to mobile services. The mobile technologies and services generated $4.4 trillion of economic value, added around 5.1% of GDP globally. This figure will grow to nearly $5 trillion by 2025 as countries increasing benefit from the improvement in productivity and efficiency brought by the increased take-up of mobile services. 5G subscription uptake has been quickly. At present, there are more than 234 million 5G connections globally, accounting for 4% of mobile connections. It is forecasted that 5G will become the dominant mobile access to the technology by subscription in 2027, accounting for 49% of all mobile connection. Therefore, we have established the foundations of 5G, but need to continue in the journey to sustain this growth. In the UAE, we have launched a national 5G strategy. It's available in our TDRA website. And our telecom service providers have already rolled out a nationwide 5G network since 2017. The UAE strategy for 5G and beyond is a result of collaborative work between the ecosystem partners coming together to shape the future of the system, of this technology. This success of 5G faced several questions on the journey. Some of these may be recalled as radiation hazard of 5G, what prospect and promises, which killer application, spectrum harmonization, network densification, and so on. The last WRC-19 added huge chunk of millimeter wave bandwidth for IMT. But the real challenges now identify is not about throughput or latency, but how to sustain the uptake of the 5G subscriber growth and the traffic demand in urban areas. GSMA forecast 2 gigahertz of mid-band spectrum, 3 to 6 gigahertz, requirement in 2025-2030 timeframe to serve the mobile broadbands in the urban areas. The lack of adequate spectrum resources will result in higher network cost and higher carbon footprint. Efforts are being made in Arab Spectrum Management Group at multiple levels to look into the 6 gigahertz different aspects. As Arab frequency regulator are looking towards the balance between different needs of different radio communication services and applications, as well as the protection of sustainability of existing services. We have two working groups in ASMG. Working group 1 is handling the preparation for IMT in the agenda item of WRC 2020, agenda item 1.2, and another working group for emerging technologies and standard is looking into the new frequency band, and of course using for Wi-Fi. Several meetings conduct with presence of industry members, workshop by industries to explain their views, and questionnaire for Arab administration being carried out to reflect the views and position of Arab countries on the use of this frequency band. Therefore, we still encourage industry to follow up with these activities in ASMG working groups and provide a related updated in order to assist Arab regulators towards making the required decision with the current position of ASMG on this frequency band within the work of Agenda Item 1.2, which we call it to follow up studies with regard to identify the frequency range 6425 to 7125 megahertz, emphasizing the protection of existing services and system and not affecting them, and then to determine the Arab position on identifying the range for IMT system in the upcoming ASMG meeting. While already some administration decided on the use of this band or part of the band for license exempt application. Based on this above, in order to proceed successfully towards balanced decision in WRC 23, which will be held in the UAE, it is important that studies continue at the ITUR working parties in efficient way toward resulting in portion or methods that reflect the needs of the interested parties and to polarized position at this stage. This will provide the delegates at WRC 23 to make the balanced decision about 6 GHz band within the Agenda Item 1.2. I would like to take this opportunity to invite all of you to the WRC 19 being hosted in UAE. It is excellent weather towards the year end and enabling environment for all delegates towards the spectrum decision, and we look forward to a good outcome of all of us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tariq, for these excellent remarks and of course, what we're all working towards, WRC 23. So we have one further presentation from policymakers. In particular, we have Olfa Jameli from the Agence Nationale des Fréquences de Tunisie. So we look forward to hearing your views. Thank you.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm happy to attend this 6 gigahertz IMT forum to share with you Tunisian approach and views on this important band. As we know, different industry started to show interest in this 6 gigahertz band, such as IMT, airline, and microwaves. Indeed, the Tunisian administration has begun to prepare to define the possible scenarios for the allocation of this band. And currently, this band in Tunisia is allocated to FS, fixed service, for microwaves. And actually, the ANF, National Agency of Frequency, has launched 3 public consultation related in part to 6 gigahertz band. The first one launched in October 2019 about microwaves needs and procedure of attribution. The second one in May 2020 about the prospect and the challenge for IMT by 2023. And the last one in September 2021 about 6 gigahertz Wi-Fi needs. And we have received a number of responses to every of this consultation and analyzed them, taking into account the situation in our country. Moreover, the ANF, or National Agency of Frequencies, is closely following the work of IMT identification in upper 6 gigahertz. I mean the 6425712 to 5 megahertz for Region 1 under WRC 23, Agenda Items 1.2, and is interested to sharing studies between IMT and the fixed service in 64257125 in order to assess the possibility in the future to allocate this band to IMT to coexistent with the existence with microwaves. And the first step taking in our administrations in this band that are the new microwave requests are postponed until the end of WRC 23 to see the result of studies and decide an optimal scenario for the future allocation of the band. And I emphasize that Tunisian administration has not interest to allocation in allocating the upper 6 gigahertz band for unlicensed Wi-Fi 6, since the current need of Tunisian administration is to reinforce the network, mobile network, and the transport network. And I highlight that the Tunisian administration has allocated the band 5 gigahertz for Wi-Fi since 2017, and the exploitation, unfortunately, the exploitation of this band does not exceed 20% of what was planned. The 5 gigahertz unlicensed spectrum needs to be first optimally utilized before we start allocating a new spectrum to Wi-Fi, and perhaps the lower 6 gigahertz allocated to Wi-Fi. Finally, I would like to share that Tunisian, we follow a structured and carefully approach to the future allocation of this important band to make sure that the spectrum is used efficiently and in the best way possible for Tunisian society. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. I think that was quite interesting to hear that there are already some plans underway with regards to the upper part and the coexistence issue there with fixed services. Now, having heard from the policymakers or regulators, we can now move on to the industry. And it's my pleasure to welcome next on stage Jan-Henrik Jochum, who is the VP Spectrum Policy and Projects from Deutsche Telekom. Please welcome him.
Thank you, Stefan, and hello, good afternoon to all of you. It's a pleasure to be here with people in the room finally again. So from an industry perspective, I would like to start with a look at the situation that we have a gap between the digitization targets and the European investment challenge. So what we can see at the moment, if you look at the state of the industry, that the European telco industry is falling far behind the US industry. And this is reason. So if you look at the last 10 years, we have lost ground, and a lot of ground. And this is due to regulation on the one hand, that is much more investment friendly in the US. And on the other hand, we face a situation with a lot of fragmentation also all over Europe, with many small jurisdictions where we have different situations and not all the same rules. This is resulting into a problem to deliver the European targets that are set by the Commission. And this situation has resulted in a 5G investment gap that was evaluated by the Boston Consulting Group to 150 billion euro. So the question is, what has it to do with spectrum with 6 gigahertz? It has a lot to do with that, because this is the resource with which, or spectrum is the resource with which we want to build the 5G networks and with which we want to deliver the European targets. And 6 gigahertz, it's a key resource to be able to deliver that one. So if we don't get it, we will have a problem. The customer demand is going up significantly currently and steady. And additional mid-band spectrum will be essential to deliver high and best network quality. There's other things like not all harmonized spectrum is available. There's spectrum put away for as a set aside for private networks. So not everything what we need was given to the mobile industry in the past. And now we are facing a situation where 6 gigahertz is in fact the only possible resource that can solve the situation for us, looking to the future and staying competitive in terms of network quality for our customers. And if you look at this slide, you can see a comparison between wide area and local spectrum. And what we need is a balanced approach here. So we have assigned in Europe the lower part of the 6 gigahertz for the airline, and you have seen it in Calvin's presentation already, what is the social economic benefits here. And if we don't get to a balanced approach, we will not be able to really benefit all from the possibilities we have. Giving the upper 6 gigahertz band would hold the balance between Wi-Fi and also 5G, and therefore also nomadic use. And this is really important in the end. And from a technical point of view, why is this band so interesting is also you can deploy it in a comparable range like you can do with 3.5. So you have a grid, you start with the C-band, you add 6 gigahertz, you get capacity, you get quality, and you get best-in-class networks. So what would happen if we don't get this? So we are all working on that one, and it's really important from our perspective. So what would happen? Europe digitization would definitely fall behind other regions like the US and China with more spectrum, with better opportunities than. It would especially further weaken the European telco industry and the capabilities to deploy the very high capacity networks that are demanded and necessary. The outdoor deployment would completely suffer in capacity and quality of service. And finally, this will cost a lot of money. It will also drive spectrum prices that further weakens the industry. So concluding all of that together, as a mobile operator, in the end, we will not be able to provide the required 5G outdoor capacity and the required network quality if in the end we will not be able to get additional mid-band spectrum out of the 6 gigahertz band. Thank you.
Well, I think that was pretty clear. If 6 gigahertz spectrum is not at least in part allocated to mobile, there will be a problem in Europe. We have a further view from Roberto Rodriguez, who is the head of spectrum strategy for Telefonica. So if you welcome Roberto to the stage, please.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for having me here to try to speak and to explain a little more on the importance of the 6 gigahertz band for to ensure the digital society future. So for those of you that don't know Telefonica, because we are not in your countries, we are present basically in Europe and in Latin, in 12 countries in total, and with a huge number of customers, mobile and fixed customers. So just to put it clear, we have fixed and mobile operators in many of these countries. So we are deploying both 4G and 5G networks, and at the same time, we are deploying fiber to the home and Wi-Fi in the home, routers and all the home services that we have to provide. And I wanted to highlight that in this, especially in Latin countries and also in some other countries in Europe, the fixed broadband services are not really so advanced. So basically, all the Latin countries has speeds about 10 to 100 megabits per second. And even in countries like like Germany and UK, the most usual broadbands are still in the 100 megabits per second range. This is going to change, and we have seen the report from GSMA Intelligence that is really calculating what would be the needs of Wi-Fi and 5G with the speeds, with fixed broadband speeds much higher than this. But we are deploying fiber in many of these countries, and that will improve. But we have to point out that the Wi-Fi speeds are really limited by the fixed broadband connection that is behind that. And that's something that is sometimes forget in the speeches that I have heard. So with this in mind, and with also the fact that the mobile penetration is much wider in all of these countries, we see that even in the most advanced countries, like in Spain, we are comfortable with the 500 megahertz spectrum that has been allocated already for Wi-Fi. We think that this is enough spectrum to ensure the home services for the future. And we think that there is also the possibility to get, higher capacity on 60 gigahertz band that is also an unlicensed band for the future. Going into the mobile part, we think that the only foreseeable opportunity for having more mid-band spectrum in the midterm is the 6 gigahertz band. And the mobile traffic is doubling every 2 years, and innovative services like artificial reality, virtual reality that we have seen in the Mobile World Congress in many expositions, it will be adding more demand into the networks. So additional mid-band spectrum, it will be critical to keep the 5G quality of services that we are deploying today, because with the traffic growing, the capacity will saturate, and at the end, the quality of services will reduce with time. So we have seen already what are the reports of the spectrum needs for 5G, and allocating this band for this upper, at least the upper 700 megahertz that is on the 6 gigahertz band for IMT towards 2013, and identifying this at the WRC23 to be able to use this, at the end, at least at the end of the decade. It will be very important to keep the services that the digital society is demanding. It will not be economically sustainable to densify the network at the point that would be needed without further spectrum in the mid-bands. So with that, is our petition is that we think that it's really needed to allocate the upper band to public mobile networks towards year 2030 to really enable the digital society future in the midterm. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Roberto. And I think it was particularly interesting that this recommendation for the upper part identification for IMT came from an operator who's both a fixed and a mobile operator. I think that puts a lot of weight behind this. So having heard from two operators, we now get the view from a vendor. We have Ulrich Drottmann, the head of standardization from Nokia. Welcome to the stage.
Thank you, Stefan, and welcome everybody. At this point in time, I was wondering also how to use these 5 minutes without being too repetitive, and also do not overcharge with information you may have seen. And I was thinking maybe to be a little bit less adding additional information, because we all know now the GSMA studies, and and others motivating the spectrum need, but be a little bit more on the imaginative side, so to speak. And we call this then 6 gigahertz to fueling the 5G advanced world. With 5G advanced, we mean then the evolution of 5G in the second part of the decade. And if you see this year at Mobile World Congress, be it our stand or those of the competitors here, of course, the evolution of 5G is the big topic, right? So the point is, when we talk about the time frame from 2025 onward, where we believe making that spectrum available will become a commercial reality. The 5G that we see now then is different than the 5G that we now experience with the Telefonica network in this year, and that of course fuels the demand. So we see a lot of extension in the services, be it on the consumer side, with the XR and VR, and you see here on the booth, in Mobile World Congress, a lot of the demonstration of that. We also see that the 5G vision that we imagine will be completed about that time frame, and I think, as was said from Jan from DT, of course, the competitiveness here meant in countries and region will massively depend on the ability to serve these demands, as we have seen in comparison to regions outside of region 1. So the 5G services which we are all striving will be massively delivered in terms of artificial intelligence, in terms of industrial applications, in terms of consumer applications. The vertical sectors, be it that they are served by slice model by the operators, or be it that IMT Spectrum is given as dedicated spectrum at both models, of course, will also strive. So all of this is needed to really fuel that the 5G vision becomes reality and ensure the growth in the second part of the decade. So we have the innovation coming from the evolution of 5G advanced, and so the standard is currently being worked on, and it is being then finalized in 2023 or 2024, and then the products will come around 25, and the ecosystem will be there. So that's then also the same time when we see that we get from the ecosystem ready from the 6 gigahertz. So when we see the World Radio Conference 23 primary allocation of the upper part, then we have that opportunity. And of course, then we have the licensing, hopefully given at 2024 and 2025. So both things fit very nicely together and will be the driver for that part. And then I only have a second slide, which basically is maybe a summary and repetition, but then I made it sort of a simple. Of course, we have a global support of that band. So then the band is also then specified in the standardization that is being done in the middle of this year. So we will be ready. And as was talked about also before, we see that the coexistence is something we work on. We have to understand both on the fixed links and on the satellite with sharing and good protection margin with satellites. We also see that when it comes to Wi-Fi, there is sufficient bandwidth in the lower part, and indeed it was interesting to hear that also from Telefonica, who also has fixed operation, to see that this is enough to satisfy the growth in that domain. And to repeat sort of from a vendor perspective, of course, the charm of the 6 gigahertz is that we can deploy this then, especially with the advance of the technology, on the existing base stations grid that we have available, and allow then a high capacity citywide urban coverage for the growth in 2025 onwards. So in summary, the 6 gigahertz will be essential to fuel then the growth in the second part of the decade for 5G. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ulrich. I think this was particularly useful. Really, in spectrum management, we have to think not in terms of next year or the year after, but we have to think in terms of 5 years or even 10 years, so giving us that vision of the 2025 to 2030 timeframe, and that's how that really comes all together and where this additional spectrum is needed. I think that was an important reminder. You can see there's lots of activity going on there. We are arranging some shares because next up we have the panel discussion on the 6 gigahertz band, and the panel is part real and in part virtual. We have Heidi Himmerman joining us remotely from the Finnish regulator Traficon. We have also Erika Tejedor from Ericsson, the Director of Government and Industry Relations, joining remotely, and furthermore, Tim Frost from MediaTek joining also remotely. But we do have present in the room, and I invite you to take your seat on the stage, please. We have Daniel Obam, CEO of the National Communications Secretariat of Kenya. Oh, there you are. I was worried there for a moment. Please do keep your mask on because we are quite close together. And we have Santiago Tenorio, Fellow and Network Architecture Director of Vodafone, another important operator with networks in multiple countries. And then we have Xu Weizong, Wireless Network Chief Strategy Officer from Huawei, another vendor. So with that, I'd like to welcome you to the stage. So, do we have the other folks? Oh yes, everybody is here. I'll try to give a sort of balanced look at the issue, and perhaps we start off again with a question for a regulator. Heidi, I was wondering, in the context of the ongoing WRC preparation process in Europe, do you think Europe will manage to consolidate a common view for the 6 gigahertz band for 5G and its evolution that will replicate the important role that Europe has played for the promotion of 3.4 to 3.8 gigahertz? Is that something you can give us your view on?
Yes, thank you. Well, of course, I'm not able to comment on behalf of all the regulators in Europe. I'm representing the Finnish regulator, but the work is ongoing, as we heard, for example, in Eric Fournier's presentation. And I'm happy to share what we think, and we think that investigating or we support the upper 6 gigahertz band for IMT. And we think it's important and hope that other regulators in Europe also would agree with this. Indeed, we see that the upper 6 gigahertz band could play an important role for 5G and also introduction of 6G in the same way as the 3.5 gigahertz band has played an important role for 5G. And also, indeed, Europe played an important role for the promotion of the 3.5 gigahertz and maybe could play an important role also for promoting the upper 6 gigahertz band for IMT.
Thank you very much for that, Heidi. So that there seems to be some momentum behind that, which is good news, of course, for 5G. Now, looking at a slightly different environment, I was wondering, Daniel, whether you can tell us something which perhaps reflects, although you're speaking for Kenya, but perhaps it reflects Africa as well. The African region was a proponent of the 6.425 to 7.125 band for consideration for IMT back in WRC 2019. What do you think would be the position of ATU when WRC 23 arrives?
Thank you, Stefan. You're asking me to predict the future. If I could do that, I would not be sitting here with you. I'd probably be somewhere else not sipping water, but something else.
Take a guess.
But let me give the background why we were the proponents for IMT for this band. The C band, we only identified up to 3.6 gigahertz for IMT. So in 2019, we needed to identify another band in the same range that would be able to deliver IMT. That's why we looked at the 6 gigahertz band to be an alternative to those countries that had identified the whole of the C band for IMT. So based on that, we went to the conference, and it was put on the agenda item for next year's conference. Our approach in identifying a spectrum for IMT has always been balanced from 2012, when we looked at the second digital dividend, and Tariq was the chair of that conference, and I'd like to acknowledge Olfa as one of our spectrum experts in Africa, where we identified the 700 megahertz band for IMT. Similarly, the C band, we only went up to 3.6, and we'd like to adopt the same approach in identifying the 6 gigahertz band. Incidentally, this band is already allocated mobile in the radio regulations. So what the work we need to do is, based on the studies, is identified for IMT. And we'd like to have that balanced approach where we look at the current allocation, fixed services, fixed satellite services, and the studies that are being undertaken in the ITUR should be able to inform us in whether we can identify the whole band or part of the band for IMT, so that we also keep the other services that were allocated in the band going. So in principle, what we have agreed in Africa is that we would like to see an IMT identification in this band, but the final details will come out as the studies continue. We have a next meeting in September, so there's probably more clarity, but in principle, we see as a block supporting identification of IMT in the 6 gigahertz band. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel, and thank you also for reminding us that in many countries, in many places, there isn't 400 megahertz available in the C-band for mobile, which further means that there's focus on the 6 gigahertz, which, as the previous speakers pointed out, is the last chance to get some spectrum for IMT in that range. So with that, Santiago, I have a question for you as an operator in 21 countries around the world. Again, both fixed and mobile service as a convergent operator. How can the 6 gigahertz contribute to the future evolution of your network? And secondly, perhaps people might ask questions with regards to, can network densification be an option? So can network densification and high bands, i.e. millimeter bands, replace the need for additional mid-band spectrum?
No, is the answer, I think, and that concludes my so no, the answer is no. We are indeed in those many countries, including, among others, Kenya through Safaricom. And I could not agree more with what you said. Even when you look at the countries where we operate in Europe, we are convergent operator. We are actually the biggest footprint in next generation broadband access. So we care about fixed as much as we care about mobile. And we are probably the single biggest consumers of Wi-Fi ourselves. And all that said, we think that is super important. It's essential to keep a balanced approach in the split of this band. Because in essence, your question about densification, which lately I hear more often than in the last few years, we could say densification, particularly in the urban areas of a region like Europe, is a myth. And what I mean by that is that if we could build a single additional base station in any urban area in Europe, we would have built it already years ago. So it's not only extremely challenging. If you consider small cells, they are not economically viable. That is the reality. And I could say the same as, what I said about the base stations. If they were economically viable, we would have actually built them probably a few years ago, even in 4G. But we didn't do that. We kept acquiring spectrum, not always affordable, not always cheap, because it was the only option forward. I agree with my colleagues from Telefonica and Deutsche as well. And what they said, we're seeing a significant growth rate for the traffic, nearly doubling every year when you count fixed and mobile. At that rate, which can be accelerated by new applications, augmented reality, metaverse, you call it, we don't think that 5G operating in C-band in Europe is going to actually be able to finish this decade. It's going to congest before that happens. Now, I think the role that 5G has in the industry, in boosting the innovation, in the economy of this region is out of question. The whole Mobile World Congress is around that theme. The digitalization of society is also out of question, but mobility plays a role. It's not only fixed and it's not only Wi-Fi. If we let 5G exhaust its capacity before the end of the decade, that will slow down the economy and that will slow down the digitalization of society. And that would be a terrible mistake that would only push this region backwards. It would increase the gap with the economy of other regions. So a balancing approach, allocating the upper band to mobile is I think, the only way to go.
I think that was pretty clear. With that, I'd like to turn to the vendors. So Xu Weizong, I have this question for you. Which deployment scenario for 5G in the 6 gigahertz band is the most relevant? Is it outdoor to indoor coverage possible at 6 gigahertz? And then, of course, we mustn't forget that Huawei is also a leading Wi-Fi supplier. Do you think Wi-Fi needs require additional mid-band spectrum?
Okay, thank you. The first question, I think for the 6 gigahertz, particularly is focused on the outdoor, because according to the 5G, right now 5G is more and more key for the digital transformation. For the metaverse, you can imagine a lot of new service will come in. For the new service should have the same experience outdoor and indoor. You cannot say, okay, metaverse is only indoor service. So this is the first point. Second point, according to the 5G spectrum selection, previous, maybe 10 years ago, no one think, maybe only very few people think C-band 3.5 is the primary band for the 5G deployment. But after 3 years of 5G deployment, globally right now we already have 200 network, 5G network. More than 90% use the mid-band. Why? Because mid-band can bring value to our customer with the high performance, lower cost, and less power consumption. So this kind of mid-band will play an important role in the future. So looking forward to the future, whether we can identify more mid-band in Europe, in China, in other regions is very essential. We also do some, last year, we also do some field test, use the latest technology for the 6 gigahertz in China, together with China regulator. We use the same site of 3.5, but we use the 128 massive MIMO, TRX massive MIMO. It's a high massive MIMO. Compared with C-band is 64 plus 64. In this scenario, for the 6 gigahertz can have the same coverage, outdoor coverage, compared with the 3.5. And another 15% of throughput gain. So that means if in the future, in the 5G beyond, in the 6th generation, the mobile industry use the mid-band can have more capacity, lower cost, and as I mentioned, lower power consumption. It's more green. So I think for the 6 gigahertz, it's very essential to provide the nationwide in the metaverse area.
Thank you very much.
Yes.
Much for particularly the point on the technology evolution that the 6 gigahertz coverage can actually match the C-band coverage. But the second part of the question with regards to Wi-Fi, perhaps you can give us your thoughts on the spectrum need for Wi-Fi.
Actually, Huawei, we provide 5G. We also provide Wi-Fi solution. We are also like Vodafone, Deutsche Telekom. We are the two service vendor. But my point, because the spectrum is very limited in your country, in another country, is the same. So, as I mentioned, 5G is more and more important. It's the engine for the future, to support the digital transformation. And Wi-Fi also is good. It's also very important. How to balance the spectrum allocation is very essential. When we consider the spectrum allocation, we think you should consider two things. First, whether this service need more spectrum. Secondly, whether this kind of spectrum can bring more value to the economic, more value to the society. So right now we think for the Wi-Fi is an indoor solution. Provide the indoor coverage and capacity and speed. There are 3 scenarios: home scenario, enterprise campus scenario, and the public like airport, shopping mall. Right now, Wi-Fi already have 2.4 and 5 gigahertz. This is very good mid-band.
Yeah.
Most of the country have more than 700 megahertz. In home scenario, in the enterprise, it's like one operate one Wi-Fi network. So based on the existing spectrum, you can already provide very high speed, high capacity for the Wi-Fi. But right now, in this kind of Wi-Fi scenario, the challenge is coverage. When you move from one room to another room, you lost your Wi-Fi signal. But this kind of issue, you cannot use the high band 6 gigahertz instead of the 2.6 or 5 gigahertz. Because the lower band, the more coverage. So this is the 2 scenarios. The only challenging scenario is for the public building, like the airport and the shopping mall. My experience in China is right now in China, 5G is already have the indoor solution coverage in the airport. I don't want to change to the Wi-Fi. Normally, I just switch off Wi-Fi in my smartphone because if I don't switch when I enter to the airport, I lost the signal. I need to input username and password. It's not convenient. So the need, whether Wi-Fi need additional, the upper 6 gigahertz. So this is one question. And secondly, the value. As the GSMI report, maybe in some country, the balance or the flow is much better, will bring more value to you. Yeah. So for Wi-Fi, I think we need to take into account whether Wi-Fi have the new need, whether Wi-Fi will bring more value to the society, to the country. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Also, that illustration of consumer demand, the preference people already express, whether they use a Wi-Fi network, faff about with a password, or just use 5G. So we have another vendor here with us. We have Erika Tejedor, the Director of Government and Industry Relations from Ericsson. And I wanted to ask you, Erica, what is your view on the detailed progress with regards to coexistence studies in the ITUR, considering the interesting statement from NFR, but also from Tunisia with the fixed links, for example, or fixed services, FS, in that band?
Thank you.
Erica?
I
Yeah.
hope you can hear me well.
Yep.
Okay. First of all, thank you everyone who is in the room. I could see that the room was pretty full. And thank you everyone also who is online listening to us. And thank you for giving us the opportunity to be here as well. Now to your question, which I think is essential on the 6 gigahertz, as we heard from ANFR, also from Tunisia, as well as from Kenya. Of course, from a regulatory perspective, is one of the main concerns. Will 5G or IMT be able to share a spectrum with the services that are there today? And I would like to make everyone remember the ITU agenda item description that calls exactly to conduct sharing and compatibility studies with the primary services in the band. And now when we talk about primary services, we have heard references to satellite services, satellite uplink. This is one of the, or is the main issue. And there are many studies that are being submitted to Working Party 5D. ANFR showed us some preliminary conclusions from their side, and we can see many contributions on this topic. And we can see that a number of studies indicate that, in fact, wide area citywide deployments are possible in the band, which is, as it was mentioned by operators, the idea to use the band for. And we can have wide area deployments while coexisting with fixed service uplink. So that's good news, because that's the main issue that is being discussed in relation to primary services in the band. There are other primary services in the band, which are satellite downlink, as well as fixed links. But this, we see that it's more of a national issue. So that there can be coordination on a case-by-case basis, mainly considering geographical separation. Then, if we look at other services that maybe they are not primary, but they are also of importance, and we have heard the mentioning of ESS, and of course, Earth exploration is a very important. It's very important globally. It's indeed very important for CPT, as ANSPAR also mentioned. And even though they are not primary, again, they are secondary and important, and there are studies being done. And I would like to also emphasize that today, this service is being deployed, and today they are actually already in an interference environment. Today, they need to share a spectrum with satellite uplink, and they need to share a spectrum with fixed links. But they have actually certain mitigations to make sure that they can work. So that's something that we also need to consider. There is also a very important, another important service, which is radio astronomy. And that is an issue in some countries, but again, this is also a national issue. So we see that geographical separation is a way to solve this problem. So all in all, of course, we need to continue the process. We need to see, we need to discuss more in detail or the studies that are being submitted to Working Party 5D. But indeed, we see that sharing and compatibility is possible in the band, also, again, assuming citywide deployments.
Thanks very much for that summary of all the issues there, and that indeed it doesn't seem to be an issue or an obstacle to the IMT identification of the upper part of 6 gigahertz. Now, last, I have a question. We also invited a leading chipset supplier, MediaTek, and we have Tim Frost here. And I have a question for you. What is your general view on 6 gigahertz spectrum allocation for both Wi-Fi and cellular technology? You supply both, so maybe you can give us a general view.
Yeah, hi everybody. Happy to be here. Thanks for inviting me. So in general, our view, I mean, obviously we can see both sides of the argument, I guess. So we support kind of increased technology evolution in general and ecosystem building for both unlicensed and licensed technologies moving forward. In general, increased spectrum availability for both obviously goes some way of supporting that, I would say. And in that sense, we have kind of a balanced approach in terms of how future spectrum should be allocated in general. For 6 gigahertz, different regions will have different views, I guess, in terms of how they see the spectrum being allocated. For Europe in particular, from our perspective, the lower 6 gigahertz, as that's been given to unlicensed spectrum, we think that the upper 6 gigahertz, it makes sense to consider that for licensed spectrum moving forward, and that's in line with the WRC 23 agenda item. And yeah, I mean, the rationale for that is what everybody else has been saying, essentially, that we think that it's a kind of important extension to 5G mid-band operation, particularly for outdoor environments and for urban areas, and to support really 5G advanced services moving forward.
Not all the regions will be the same, or not all countries make the same decisions. What about the feasibility for devices to support both licensed and unlicensed technologies in the upper and lower 6 gigahertz band, taking into account different region-specific requirements?
Yeah, so in general, we think it's feasible technically to support upper licensed in the upper 6 gigahertz and unlicensed in the lower 6 gigahertz in the same device. We don't really see any issues there. In terms of the regional specific requirements, of course, if there's harmonization across all regions, that does make things simpler from a device perspective in general, I would say. But in practice, that doesn't happen because there's different regional needs and market considerations across the globe, essentially, in different regions. So, but in general, I would say that devices today, they already support these kind of aspects. So they already overcome these challenges today in terms of particular frequency bands not being aligned fully or supported fully in all regions. And devices need to support those today. So we don't really see that 6 gigahertz is too different from that perspective. So we think it's technically feasible to cover that as well for 6 gigahertz.
Great. Well, thank you for that. Sadly, we are running out of time, but thank you everyone remotely and in person for your views. And it seems it's very clear that an IMT identification in 6 gigahertz is essential for the success of 5G in the 2025 to 2030 timeframe. I think vendors, regulators, and operators can see this. And perhaps we can see a good illustration of the need for mid-band spectrum is the prices that have been paid at auction for C-band spectrum, for example, in the US, I mean, in excess of $2 per megahertz pop, which previously people thought these are outlandish prices for sub 1 gigahertz spectrum, and now these prices are being paid for mid-band spectrum. So you can see the economic importance of this. So with that, I like, please do thank the panel in the usual way. And now I'll briefly hand back to Calvin to wrap up the session. Thank you.
Thank you very much to all of the panelists that just spoke, both here and virtually as well, and taking their time. I'm conscious we've overrun, so I won't spend too much more time. But I just wanted to say this has been very interesting and educational from my perspective. I think what's really encouraging is that a lot of the things that we've been suggesting in recent months in terms of the importance of taking the time to consider this decision, making sure we've got all the relevant evidence and analysis, I think was really borne out by a lot of our our presenters and speakers here, especially on the policymaker side, which, when we're talking about spectrum being used over a 15, 20-year time frame, I think is really important. We want to assign the right amount of spectrum, but we shouldn't rush it if it means not getting it right. So with that in mind, I'd like to again particularly thank all of the presenters and panelists and Stefan for moderating. I'd like to thank all of you both here and also a number of you remotely who've dialed in. I hope you've all found it as interesting as we have. And with that, I would like to close the session. Thank you very much, everyone.